Hi, and welcome to the Delta Dialog. In this podcast, we talk about open data, open medical data, and AI from above and beyond, and explore its implications to our world. On the third episode of our series on open medical data, we discuss open medical data and AI in Europe. I'm your host, Emir Mustafa. I'm joined today by my co host and commentator, David Wood, and our guest speaker, Patrick Lahner. Patrick Lahner is a professor of AI at Germany's Deggendorf Institute of Technology. He runs his own AI consulting firm, Skyrocket.ai. He previously worked for CERN, headed the corporate AI competence center at Krohn's Group, and as an expert witness, advised the parliaments of France, Germany, and Luxembourg on AI. Hi, Patrick. Can you tell us about yourself and what you're currently working on?
Hi, thanks for having me on the show. Currently, I work a lot on the AI Act, which is the EU's approach to regulating AI, and I guess we'll be talking more about that today. Aside from that, I'm pretty busy during this term teaching a course on quantum computing. So I'm very interested in quantum computing because it allows us to solve certain computational problems, including some AI problems, substantially faster. And I teach a course on quantum computing in Deggendorf this term.
Great. So let's start with an article you wrote for the UN. You mentioned the European Health Data Space. What is the European Health Data Space and what do they do and how do they work?
Well, the European Health Data Space is an initiative that was proposed by the EU earlier this year. If you look at Europe, it's called the European Union, yet all the member states are sovereign and they sort of have their own laws and rules. So we have a lot of fragmentation when it comes to data because you have these national islands and sharing data is extremely difficult because systems use different kinds of databases. There's all sorts of laws making this difficult. Yet, when it comes to health, we should share some of that data. So, because if you move from one country to the other, sort of your new doctors cannot access your old doctor, and this initiative would make that easier. There are also rare diseases for which there are just a few cases every year in a country, and if you have more data available from the whole European Union, this could definitely help people who suffer from rare diseases when it comes to their treatment. So overall, that's an initiative by the European Union proposed earlier this year, and I think it has great potential to skyrocket healthcare here in Europe.
So, how would you describe their role in open medical data in Europe? Do you believe they're the main protagonists in the region for the call of open medical data, or is there someone else?
Well, I think it's a great initiative and probably one that looks the most promising because obviously there are other initiatives pushed for by individual member states. But if the European Commission moves forward with that initiative, obviously that will get most traction sooner or later because it's not just single countries, but the Union as a whole. So I think there is great potential. Obviously, there are all sorts of regulatory challenges that we'll be talking about today. But I think it's a great initiative, and I hope we'll be able to move forward with it in the coming years.
Patrick, will some of the countries need to change more than others if there is standardization on the data structures? I mean, are we essentially seeing a battle between one group of countries who've already sort of consolidated around one set of ideas for standards versus others?
Well, smaller countries can probably do that conversion quicker than the big countries because if you look at Germany, we have 80 million inhabitants. We have more than or a few hundred different health insurance providers, all sorts of different hospitals. And if you have a small country like Luxembourg or Estonia, obviously they may have just one or two health insurance providers and a couple of hospitals. So they will be able to do this simply quicker than the bigger countries, I think.
Patrick, you mentioned in another article on the UN that more data is better, referring to bias in big data sets. How does this concept actually apply to open medical data? Since, if done correctly, there will be immense amounts of data from researchers to patients and data files and everything.
Well, thanks for referring to my article. My argument was actually slightly different. Right now, this belief around big data is the more data, the better. But it isn't that. You need more representative data, even if it's less data, but that is more representative. Just adding more data may help in some cases, but if you just add more low quality, noisy bias data, your results will get worse. So we need potentially less data, but better data. I think that's so important, and that's what a lot of researchers have been ignoring for the last 10 to 15 years. And there was this big push from Silicon Valley towards big data, and there were beliefs like the more the better. Now we notice it doesn't necessarily work like that. More data could be helpful, obviously, but it also needs to be high quality and come with low bias. And if you just add a lot of bias data, it won't get you anywhere.
Okay, and when you say high quality, it has to have reference. What do you actually mean by that?
Well, it needs to be data that is also curated by experts, because if you take a look at most data, like in hospitals, was maybe entered by doctors or assistants. They didn't have enough time to carefully review it. Now it's in the database. So you also need to curate the data before you try to learn from it. Otherwise, if there are a lot of errors in it, you will ultimately learn them. You can do that, but finally, we want high quality decisions. So data scientists, they're myself, I'm a data scientist too. Data scientists are super important, but we're not domain experts. And if you just look at the raw data, obviously there will always be some variables that correlate and you can learn something from it. But does that make sense? That's another question. And that's where you need to include domain experts also for the curation of the raw data.
Patrick, the counter argument from Silicon Valley is that if you've got enough data, the biases will cancel out. So there might be some who are recorded a bit high and some that are recorded a bit low. But with more and more data, then the true patterns will emerge. How do you evaluate that?
I personally disagree about that. Obviously, that's a belief that was pushed especially by hardware vendors like Nvidia and so forth, because they hope you just collect more and more data. You need more and more hardware. And if you look some of the original proponents of that, like Andrew Ng, he's now actually going back to saying we need less data, we need smaller data sets and learn from them. And I think that's the right direction. In some cases, obviously, big data is very helpful, but overall, we need high quality and unbiased data. So just having more data is not necessarily helpful. And also now, when it comes to these very large deep learning models for which you need a lot of data, training them is not very sustainable. We're all now talking about energy and global challenges like climate change. Yeah, and then if you train a new deep model from scratch and you need to spend millions of dollars just on training that in terms of the electricity, I'm not sure if that is very sustainable in the long run. So sometimes we may need that, but overall, we need to first of all look at quality and biases. And then if we have more of that data, that's great.
One other thing I would like to touch upon is that the European Commission recently proposed the Data Act. As far as you know, what can we expect from this move, and how would it then actually improve access to open medical data?
Yeah, the Data Act is a new proposal among many different acts that have been proposed in the last few years. The Data Act would force service providers or hardware vendors to make their data or the data that they collect accessible so that you, maybe as a consumer or a competitor, could access that data. I'm not fully sure how they imagine this would eventually work out, because companies would be sort of forced to share their trade secrets with others. And they also want to make it very easy to switch from one cloud provider to the other. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, especially if you use very specific features offered by some cloud providers. And then that would sort of mean they're not allowed to offer that anymore if it should be easy to switch. So when it comes to the implementation and enforcement, I'm not that sure how that would work. And we would force European companies to make their trade secrets available, and then their US competitors would access that, but they would not have to share their trade secrets. So overall, I think the intention is good because right now there's this belief, that we don't have control of our data and something is done with the data, and maybe some access to it is helpful, especially when it comes to healthcare. But sort of forcing companies to share their trade secrets, I'm not so sure if that would really be very helpful, because also you may strengthen your competitors. You may reduce investments because it may not make sense to invest in a competitive edge anymore, because eventually you're forced to share this with your competitors. So I'm finally not too sure if that would really work out. But all of this has to do with big government. If you look at the European Commission, the European Parliament, most of the people who sit there, they have never worked outside politics and they never had to send any bills. So maybe they're just not aware of what a trade secret is and what the consequence of something like the Data Act would be eventually.
So, why are they asking for these trade secrets to be revealed? And how do they respond to the feedback of people like you who say, hang on, this isn't going to work in a commercial setting?
I think overall, a lot of politicians are sort of scared of, data analysis, AI, and so forth. So they think it's something very obscure that hurts people. But in fact, we benefit a lot from AI and, data analysis, because our prosperity goes up, healthcare gets better. So first of all, we should see opportunities. We should be driven by opportunities, not by fears. But when I talk to politicians on the European level, but also on federal level, typically those who are scared the most, they're even not willing to engage in discussions. So when we do, I'm a member of the German AI Association. We did a big event in Brussels a few weeks ago, next to the European Parliament in the Bavarian State Representation Office. And we invited a lot of members of parliament to talk about the AI Act and the Data Act. And those who actually came, accepted the invitation, were the ones who already agreed with us. And those who don't agree, who are most scared of AI, they even didn't want to come and discuss with us. So that's something I find very sad.
And once again, why do they want the trade secrets to be revealed? Because I'm sympathetic to identifying risks and thinking ahead about risks, but how will it help to avoid the risks if these companies have to disclose publicly their trade secrets?
Yeah, that's the thing. I also don't know. I don't really see the benefit of, enforcing or forcing companies to make their trade secrets available to everyone. The European Union probably hopes to increase competition like this, that, you're not allowed to keep the data in private, you have to share it with others. But eventually, this could really stifle innovation and lead to less investments in Europe if you're eventually forced to share your trade secrets with others.
I can see one argument on this, which is that the public need confidence that the algorithms aren't defective, that the data isn't deeply biased, and so there should be some scrutiny of it. But that doesn't mean to say it needs to be a public scrutiny. There could be somebody doing an auditing behind the scenes. After all, we insist that financial companies, rather that companies have their finances audited. But the auditors don't publish all their findings. They don't publish all the emails they've reviewed. We trust the auditors to keep these things secret. So I can see a case for an EU body which does check things out and flags up, hey, these companies got a deeply biased, deeply unsafe algorithm, but they wouldn't publish it online. Has that been discussed to your knowledge?
That has not really been discussed, but I totally agree with your point. I think, there's a lot of fear, and a lot of people are sort of scared of AI because they don't understand how it works. But that's not something unique coming with AI. A lot of things around us we don't understand. Like most of us don't know how an engine works in detail, or sort of medicine that we take. We don't know how it works. Even those who developed the original trucks often don't fully understand how it works, but what they've done were clinical trials, and then you can assess the risk. And just making everything public doesn't necessarily help to understand it, because a lot of things are not necessarily understandable at all.
Aspirin was a famous example. Aspirin was used for many decades before people finally figured out how it managed to deal with pain and its other positive side effects. So, of course, there are things we don't understand. But we need to be better, I think, at embracing uncertainty, figuring out which uncertainty might be truly dangerous. That's fair. If we're not sure what's around the corner, we don't drive very fast around the corner just in case there's some terrible thing that we're about to crash into. So thinking ahead's appropriate. But if there's no reason to think that taking an aspirin is going to kill billions of people, then it's all right to deploy it, even though the mechanism hasn't been fully understood.
Absolutely. So what we need to embrace is testing and so forth, and then we can assess risks. And I think overall, we also need to increase education, make the general public more aware of what AI is, and maybe slightly explain them how it works. For example, in my university in Deggendorf, we started an event 2 years ago that we called a science bench. Universities, they're just so far away from most people in society. They keep paying for us, but they don't really know what they do. So we said we would get closer to them. And I sat for 2 hours on a bench in the city center. We announced this event before in the newspaper, and pedestrians could just sit next to me and ask any questions they had about AI. And sort of there was like an old man, a retiree. He sort of said, well, AI would not affect him at all. That was something maybe for his grandchildren. And I asked him, hey, do you have a smartphone? And he said, yes. And I said, yeah, there's plenty of AI. Or I don't know, if you go to your doctor, they use nowadays quite some AI. So AI is also something from which you are benefiting. And then suddenly he was much more supportive and also felt that AI is something that was actually positive for him and not only his grandchildren.
One thing I actually wanted to ask was that you mentioned there needs to be a lot of testing has to be done to make certain decisions, and with the competition aspect of it as well. Don't you think that maybe for testing purposes that this data act actually can start with the healthcare industry, since the healthcare industry is quite important, and in terms of developing actual cures and medicines and just better treatments, wouldn't that actually help?
Yeah, well, I'm not against the Data Act at all. I think it has a good intention, but it's probably going too far, and there are, I think, plenty of sectors to which it should not necessarily be applied. I don't know, like mechanical engineering and so forth. Healthcare is maybe something more towards the public good where it can be applied, but maybe not to that extreme like the one that has been proposed so far. But sharing some data, pooling data can obviously be very helpful in healthcare, but you should not force eventually companies to share their trade secrets. If you do, probably they will not invest anymore.
Since we're talking about all these policies and acts, from our previous conversation with Janet, another speaker, we've come to understand that the policy infrastructure for open medical data is actually one of the cornerstones of the project. You've personally advised parliaments of France, Germany, and Luxembourg. How are policymakers looking towards policy infrastructures, and what are some of the core challenges facing policymakers in this regard?
Well, having advised these three parliaments, I have to say it was a very strange experience. So they invite experts and they ask all sorts of questions, but no one actually keeps listening to these experts. Most of the members of parliament, they just kept working on their phone or computer while we were there as expert witnesses. Even the other expert witnesses kept using their phones or computer while the others were talking. So finally, I all of that was sort of an obscure experience because I don't really know if they learned anything from it. And with regards to policy infrastructure, um, I'm not fully sure how they think about it because, I gave my speech in the hearings, but finally, if you just see that most members of parliament keep looking at their phones the whole time, I'm not so sure how far they were actually learning it from us.
So, to be clear, this isn't an EU thing, it's something that applied to each of the national parliaments or even the federal parliaments as well. Because I can imagine there are various people listening to this based in Britain who are, dare I mention the B word, who are hateful of what they see as EU institutions that are slow and sclerotic and counterproductive and bureaucratic. But what you're pointing out here is something different. It's the fact that politicians at local and national levels, as well as at the European levels, frankly, aren't engaging with this in the right way. It's quite shocking that experts like you, who've spent years learning about things, sharing your insight, and these politicians aren't paying attention. It's deeply dysfunctional. Do you have any hopes for this being improved? Is it just a matter of education, or do we need to find better advisors for some of these politicians so that the advisors can say, pay attention, this guy really knows what he's talking about? These other ones are just here for window dressing, but when Patrick's there, definitely pay attention. Is it a matter of advisors, or what else do you hope for in terms of improving this caliber of political discussion?
Obviously, I would hope for that they actually listen to the experts and maybe also invite more critical experts, because I noticed most of the groups in the German parliament, they mainly invited stakeholders that kept telling the politicians what they wanted to hear. So hearing critical voices is something they don't really want, or most of the parties didn't want. So maybe, and then I don't know why you actually invite those people if they just keep telling you what you actually wanted to hear. Maybe you should invite, more experts to actually have a discussion, to have a lot of disagreements, and then finally I think more people would learn from it and you could reach a better consensus. I think that's what we desperately need, and that's something I absolutely did not see in the German parliament so far.
To be fair, businesses do the same. Business executive teams sometimes invite in consultants to tell the executives what they want to hear. They've got a plan in mind, it's quite scary, and they just get these apparent experts to reinforce their views. So it's not just a political malaise here, it's a human malaise, I think. And you're quite right. We need to raise the caliber of this discussion because, frankly, the issues are large, the opportunities are enormous, and we're going to miss these opportunities if we are still in our rather small-minded, rational thinking.
Regarding these parliaments and the rules and regulations they put out, I'm actually wondering about the Privacy Act. Like the European Union itself has a lot of rules and regulations, especially when it comes to data, as we all mentioned. The most famous one actually being the GDPR. I mean, I think that's one aspect that's known worldwide. What do you think are some of the challenges facing open medical data in this regard?
Well, the GDPR is often cited as a reason why things are believed that, or why stakeholders believe things cannot be done. They often claim GDPR forbids them to do many things, also in healthcare. Now, I think the intention of the GDPR is also very positive. We want people to have their data protected, and we don't want that companies can do whatever they want to do with the data, like in the US. Now, the GDPR again is, probably more than 100 pages long. It's largely non-specific language, and you just don't know what all of that means. It's very vague and not very concrete. That's why it's actually unclear what's allowed and what's forbidden. I wish to see a GDPR that is maybe substantially shorter and much more precise. And I think then a lot of doubts would also disappear very quickly. And here in Germany, I often see that GDPR is cited simply as a reason when stakeholders don't want to do things or they don't feel they were able to do it, they just say, well, the GDPR forbids us to do that. So if it was shorter and more precise, probably it would be much more concrete. And then probably we could also share more data in healthcare, because there are even arguments that GDPR keeps killing people, because we're not allowed to share data, especially say around rare diseases, and then people die. And actually, we have all the data necessary to analyze, and we could probably offer better and cheaper treatment to these people. But there's not just GDPR that makes things difficult. Also, there's this medical device regulation in the EU that was just ratified a few years ago, and also experts were warning about it, that it would lead to enormous costs. And now we're starting to see this in Europe, that it's true that a lot of companies will stop selling their products in Europe because just recertifying them is too expensive. So there are products that were now for 30 years on the market, saved many lives. It's too expensive or impossible to recertify, so they will disappear. And eventually people will die. And that's currently a big problem. And it's become more obvious now in the last few months. And I think there was also a discussion on this in the European Parliament like 2 weeks ago or something like that.
Do you have any idea if they are going to, I mean, the recent conversation that has been in the European Parliament, do you have any idea if they're going to rescind that or find a solution for it, or will that take another 2 years as well?
Probably will take another few years. It's been proposed now by various stakeholders. We should maybe recognize the US certification, the FDA certification, because that one seems to be much more hands on, much more practical. And if we also started accepting that in Europe, probably a lot of things would become much easier.
Well, the thing is one other question I wanted to ask regarding the GDPR is that how is it going to be possible to push or to call for open medical data while complying with regulations such as the GDPR or the more recent AI Act, which we will get into in a few moments?
Yeah, first of all, the GDPR and the Data Act, they sort of seem to be contradictory. GDPR constrains you to share data, while the Data Act would force you to share data. But the GDPR says something like if you have a legitimate interest, then you're allowed to share it or process it. But what does that mean? And again, that is not clearly specified. So a big problem in the GDPR is just this very vague, very non-specific language, and that these documents were written by lawyers, not by domain experts. And I think that leads to a lot of problems because those who wrote those documents, they didn't have any domain expertise. And I think there will be a lot of conflicts between the GDPR and the Data Act. It would be great if some of these conflicts were actually resolved by just coming up with more concrete and probably also shorter documents. Because if you have hundreds of pages written by lawyers, no one really knows what it means. And then court rulings are different. Even, within Germany, we also have our own German data protection law, but interpretation is up to to an agency responsible to data protection, which is not on the federal level, but there's one in every state. So we have 16 states, and enforcement of data protection is different among these 16 states because each agency on the state level interprets the GDPR and the German data protection law differently. And if even within Germany we're unable to agree on what GDPR means, it's even a bigger problem within the EU because maybe some East European countries are more hands on, more open to change, while maybe Germany or Italy, whatever, are maybe more conservative and they interpret GDPR differently. And all of that is due to very long documents that are not concrete at all.
So, who is working on this? Are there people who are saying GDPR was well intentioned, but now, as you have said, we have to ensure it makes sense from the point of view of domain experts? We have to make it more precise, we have to make it shorter. Are there people, serious people, working on this, or is it just that everybody's unhappy about it and saying, well, this isn't very good, is it? But what can we do?
I think some members of the European Parliament they are aware of that the GDPR so far is a disaster and it needs to be revised, and that the original intention was maybe good, but finally it didn't work out. But I don't see there's a big movement to actually making these changes. Remember, in a little bit more than 1 year, there will be an election in the European Parliament. So probably they'll be working for the next 6 months or something like this. And then for the following 9 months, all the members and parties will be entirely focusing on the coming election. So I don't see this happening anytime soon.
That's a bit depressing. And you described the GDPR not just as having some unfortunate aspects, you said it's a disaster.
Absolutely. I think it had a very good intention, but finally it did not work out, and we should finally make a change. And yeah, keep it probably much shorter and much more concrete. And then I think a lot of the problems would disappear.
Do some of your colleagues in academia or in throughout the industry, do they agree with you? Are you part of some mailing list or some WhatsApp group or some academic equivalent of WhatsApp that are sharing these views and making more concrete proposals?
Well, I'm involved very much in the German AI Association, and there most of our members are startups, and obviously things like the GDPR, AI Act, whatever, keep stifling them the most because for them it's just very, very difficult to be compliant. If you look at hyperscalers like Amazon and Microsoft, obviously it's easier for them to be compliant because they will just hire 1,000 lawyers or something like this. I think one big problem of the GDPR is also enforcement, because enforcement is up to the member states. And then you have some member states, like Luxembourg, for example, they effectively don't enforce GDPR because their national agency has maybe 5 employees and they just don't really care, while other countries try to over enforce it. So I think if you want to enforce a EU-wide law like that, you should also enforce it on the EU level, and you should enforce it the same in every member state and not differently like it's done right now. Because like this has also severe impact on innovation and relocation of companies, and the non-existing enforcement of the GDPR is also one of the reasons why a lot of companies move their headquarters to Luxembourg, because it's not enforced and you're headquartered there.
But is that not a risk? Like, let's say suddenly Luxembourg decides to do the enforcement that is well proposed by the EU, then wouldn't they have to relocate again, or do you think that won't happen?
Well, there are other incentives for Luxembourg as well, like taxation and so forth, but I think enforcing the GDPR or those other regulations through an EU body would certainly be much more helpful than enforcing it differently in the individual member states.
Let's come back to a concrete question again about the recertification of medical devices. And you pointed out that some very useful medical devices, which have been saving lives for decades, may no longer be available because the corporations who create them face too daunting a task to recertify. So, do you agree that there should be some occasional recertification, that you can't just say, well, this worked well 20 years ago, so we don't need to check it again? Do you agree that there should be some ongoing auditing?
Absolutely, because the whole environment, society, and laws keep changing. So there must be some recertification every now and then. But now with the medical device regulation, we simply have too much regulation and too much enforcement, and especially for SMEs, they're just not able to do it. It's infeasible, and they're unable to afford it. And finally, they have to fire people. They have to maybe close some of their product lines. That's the sad thing, but it's even sadder that people will not get the treatment anymore they could get. And while, if something worked for the last 20 or 30 years, maybe recertification shouldn't be too difficult. Like maybe for a new product, or some new gene therapy, whatever, probably you would need a lot of certification. But if it's just about artificial knees, whatever, and that has worked for the last 30 years and has given a lot of people a better life, why make it too difficult? I don't really see the point for that. And also think about the risk and the outcome. So if your knee doesn't work anymore and you have an artificial knee that can help you, what's really the worst case that can happen? Well, you go back to your original situation, that maybe the artificial knee doesn't work that well because you couldn't walk anyway before. With a gene therapy, maybe you would need much stricter certification, because this could obviously create enormous disaster. So I think we need to look more at the risks and potential outcomes, and sort of correlate that with the requirements for certification.
And on this topic, you suggested, why not copy from the US FDA device certification? That seems very sensible. Are there European politicians who are seriously contemplating that? Because that would seem to be a sensible way forwards if it stands up to scrutiny.
It's a new approach I had just recently heard about, and it's, for example, seriously being discussed in Switzerland. So they're not part of the EU, yet they are affected by a lot of EU laws eventually. And there, more and more policymakers have strongly asked for FDA to be recognized there as well. And some policymakers in Europe. I hope this topic will get more traction in the coming months.
We have mentioned the Data Act and other acts, but one of the main actors right now is the AI Act. And you mentioned in your articles about the difficulties and challenges regarding the AI Act, and one of its problems being its definition according to the European Commission. How would you define AI, and could you elaborate on why this is such a challenge for the AI Act?
So AI is a very interdisciplinary field that has intersections with many other disciplines, statistics, signal processing, and many others. So how do you define AI? From a very high level perspective, I would say an AI allows us to automate human decision making. Now that's obviously extremely generic. You need to be more precise. The AI Act, first of all, said an AI could be an expert system, so a logic based system, machine learning, neural networks. And I think, yeah, machine learning, neural networks, that's probably most of today's AI. If you go to expert systems and logic, maybe some of that is AI, some is not. But then the AI Act further states an AI would also be, or every possible optimization technique or statistical method would be an AI as well. And that's where I absolutely disagree, because once you have three numbers and you calculate the mean, that's a statistical method, and that would be an AI. So every simple calculator now would be an AI, and that's certainly not, because it doesn't do decision making, and the risk or the impact of a wrong calculation in a calculator is also negligible. And then every possible optimization technique, not sure, because you would then go into sort of most of maths. And then every Google search, every database query would eventually be an AI, because you do some optimization to speed up the querying, but you don't have any decision making behind. So I think defining AI is tricky. I don't have that one precise definition. And if I look into my computer science department, where maybe 20 professors who do AI full time, and we all disagree about how you would actually define AI. Now, trying to define it from a legal perspective is tricky. And the EU has attempted it, but it's just lawyers who attempted it. They never actually talked to computer scientists, because they said, well, expert systems, machine learning, optimization techniques, statistics, if software does some of that. But then when I gave when I was an expert witness in the German parliament last year already, and in the French parliament, the AI Act had just appeared, I said, well, you don't need software to do that. You can build purely a hardware device, which is, you just implement logic through hardware. You don't need any operating system. You don't need any software. Like this, you can also build an AI, and then it would not be covered by the AI Act. So one of the drafters of the AI Act then came back to me and wanted, how can you build a computer without software, only with hardware? We didn't know that was possible. And that's, what you learn in your first year when you study computer science. So it's a problem if purely lawyers try to write such definitions and they don't actually check back with domain experts. I personally don't think we should try to define AI at all. We should only maybe address use cases and risks, and not really care about how those use cases are implemented. If it's a logic based system or a deep neural network, finally, I don't care if the output is disastrous. We should focus on use cases and regulate them if necessary. But I think a lot of critical use cases are regulated today already, and you don't need to have an AI specific regulation for that, because AI is just a tool. It's not the actual use case or outcome.
So we shouldn't focus on the technology per se. And this is a core message that I used to work with in my days as a software engineering director. Sometimes people would write on their requirements, we must have this technology built into our product. And we have to go back to them and say, why do you need this? Well, we've been told we need it. Why do you need it? Well, there's this use case. And then we would say, well, actually, if you really want this use case, there's a better way to do it. And so that was a fault that some technologists would fall into, over focus on technology. But now you're saying that it's the lawyers likewise are falling into the same fault, looking at the not seeing the outcomes, the possible outcomes. And I entirely agree with you there.
Yeah, thanks. I totally agree with you too, because the AI Act is horizontal, so it would address AI for every possible use case. But I think we should, where there are critical use cases, like you want to build a nuclear power plant, a car, an airplane, whatever, where it's really about health and safety and about human lives. All of that is regulated already for decades. And it just doesn't matter how you implement a piece of software in an airplane or car, because finally there's a use case, there's a risk, potential outcomes. And if it's an AI or not, I don't care. I need to address the risk. That's why I don't really think the AI Act is necessary at all, because we should focus on use cases, vertical regulation, and most of that is regulated already. And if really some new topics, some new risks come up through AI and some use cases, well, then let's amend that vertical regulation or introduce new vertical regulation. But then we shouldn't regulate that for AI. We should regulate that use case, and because now we try to define AI, and then you try to ban using AI for that use case. Then in 10 years, you find a different way to implement that use case, and then it's suddenly not banned. So we should address the use cases and not the actual implementation.
Now, we've been saying some rather critical things about lawyers in this discussion. Do you accept that lawyers vary, and do you encourage the development of lawyers who are dual experts? Because it is important to understand regulatory systems, but there are a small number of degrees or study courses, I understand, which combine regulations and legal aspects with technology.
Well, I think lawyers are obviously very helpful. So I'm not negative when it comes to lawyers. A friend of mine, for example, he advises a lot of companies around IT. He's a lawyer, but he also did a bachelor's in physics. So I think that's an excellent combination to, he's a lawyer, he went to law school, he did the bar exam, but he also has a degree in physics. So he can actually build that bridge between technology and law. And I think maybe more LLM programs or something like this could come up for lawyers, so they could get an introduction to tech, learn what's coding, what an AI is, learn how databases work, and probably their work would become substantially easier for them, and the output would probably be better because they would finally know how those things work they are trying to regulate. So I see there's a lot of potential for this. On the other hand, we also need to train computer science students in those topics. So I teach a course that I call Innovation Management for AI, in which I teach my students how to bridge that gap from technology to business, how they can make sure finally they're not just building AI prototypes, but they build things that work and add value. So they need to know about regulatory challenges. They also need to know about patents, for example. So patenting AIs is again a huge topic that is extremely complex, because you cannot patent an AI per se, but you can patent an application that includes some AI or some device that takes advantage of AI. And our graduates also need to know about that. Otherwise, they build product or they build prototypes that finally cannot be turned into products because of regulatory and patent issues. So in conclusion, we should train techies also in law, and we should train lawyers also in tech.
And I think we need to educate the general public in both, which is part of the WAN's mission. You're here, and we're here because we believe the general public is behind in many of these issues. So thanks very much. And we need to do a heck of a lot more of this.
I mean, since we talked about the AI Act, but how does this act, like, what's actually the scope of this act? Like, what does it do that kind of limits the European Union in that way? And like, what is it actually?
So the AI Act would address AI for every possible use case. Now there are use cases that are critical and some that are not that critical. And there's a risk classification scheme in the AI Act. There are certain use cases that would be entirely banned, and then there would be high risk ones and there would be low risk ones. Now, what is banned? For example, social scoring would be banned. This is one of the things they would ban. But they also, for example, want to ban AI for employment. And then I think, well, that's maybe not that great to ban it, because an AI can help, in recruiting. An AI could help in, you know, find or determining bonuses for employees. So maybe the AI should not make the ultimate decision, but should make recommendations to HR. And they also want to entirely ban this. Now, the biggest part would be the high risk domain. And what does high risk mean? High risk means to me there is an enormous threat to health and safety. So it's really about human lives. The definition in the AI Act is again very vague. Initially, they wrote something like high risk means from it's an application from which you could get any threat or any loss, no matter what, be it physical, psychological. So a Google search would also be high risk because you could get some mental damage from the result, theoretically. They tried to make this a little bit more concrete in recent revisions, yet it's still extremely unclear what would actually be high risk and what would not. The EU claims it would be around 10% of the use cases. I personally think it's more than 80% that would be high risk because of this very, very unclear definition of what high risk is. And then for high risk, you have requirements. And the AI Act would require you to use a data set that is perfect, complete, error free, bias free, but that doesn't exist. There's always some error or bias in your data. You actually need some sort of bias to actually learn. And if you require to use a complete data set, you would actually violate the GDPR. So you're again creating all sorts of contradictions between these acts. And to me, the requirements for high risk AI in the AI Act just seems unfeasible. You will not be able to build a system of that sort because the legal constraints just do not work. They're not reasonable. Maybe they should say something like very unbiased, very complete, very error free. But again, you would have to define what that means. But if you require absolute freeness of errors and bias, then it's just impossible.
It would be as if we banned all motor cars driving at more than 20 miles per hour, because there's always a risk if we're driving faster that there will be an accident, psychological damage or physical damage. But we decide as a society, there are so many benefits to being able to drive a bit faster than 20 miles an hour. We would have banned step ladders, because step ladders can fall down and people can fall off them. And we shouldn't be casual. We shouldn't be foolish. We have rules specifying that ladders should be robust and shouldn't fall over easily. We have rules about when you can drive fast and when you can drive slow. So there is a case for rules, but it shouldn't be these blanket rules. I'm sure you're entirely right there.
Well, what you said is so important. In fact, the EU Commission has also proposed recently that they want to reduce the number of casualties in traffic to absolute zero by 2050, whatever, in the EU. I know every death is a big disaster for families, but if your goal is to reach absolute zero, you would have to ban cars effectively. Um, and that's really one of the goals of the EU for 2050 or 45, whatever. And if you want to reach absolute zero, you would have to ban all transportation effectively. Otherwise, there's always some risk that someone dies. But also, if you reintroduce horses, they may just overrun someone on the road. So reaching that absolute zero, I don't know how that should be possible. And like in Germany, we have about 3,000 casualties in traffic every year, which is very sad. But if you go back 40 years ago, it was like 20 or 30,000. And there was much less transportation 30 or 40 years ago. So we have already become much, much better. And obviously, we should further reduce. But reaching zero is impossible. But the EU believes that reaching zero was possible.
So we need targeted, smart dynamic regulation rather than these blunt, one size fits all heavyweight mechanisms. Otherwise, we won't get the benefits. And the benefits are matters of life and death as well. That's a very important point which you made earlier.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, well, that's kind of like one of the issues here is that strategy on AI. I think bringing it back to that discussion, Patrick, I just wanted to ask about just the evolution of AI strategy in the European Union. Which trend is it following? Like, do you think it's going better, or is it taking like one step forward, two steps back? And there are projects using AI, such as reducing climate change and just open medical data, pushing it forward. How do you think the future looks in this regard?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think there is actually a clear AI strategy in Europe. What was published maybe some 2 or 3 years, 3 years ago, was a white paper on AI, which was again very negative, I felt, mainly driven by fears. And it did not consider actually what was happening outside the EU. So I looked into that white paper and I did a free text search, and I never found words like China or whatever in the document. And obviously, when it now comes to AI and innovation, China is a big player, maybe even the leading player. So we should also look around the world, what's happening outside the EU, and that's something that that initial strategy did not address at all. And now I'm a techie, but I also did an MBA and work in business. Never come up just with a strategy. First, you need a mission and vision. There are all these terms. And then based on that, you will build a strategy. But I've never seen that big mission or vision for the EU where they want to get. I only see strategies, but the overall goal is missing. And then once you have that goal, yes, you need strategies, but they also should be realistic, and you should look around the world what's happening in other parts of the world, because we need to remain competitive. And that's something so far I have not seen in the EU documents. And I think we should, I keep saying we need less regulators in Europe and more innovators. I think that's so important. And right now we mainly have regulators and just a few innovators, and we have to change that proportion. And that should be maybe on the foremost mind of the EU: less regulators, more innovators, and increase competitiveness.
So, what should the vision and mission for AI in Europe be?
Increase competitiveness for in every industry, I would say, and use AI to the most to remain competitive. So we can also have a healthier population. We can have better and faster and cheaper healthcare. We have an aging population in Europe, so AI seems extremely helpful, not only in healthcare, but I see a lot of people, they're sort of scared that an AI would, put them out of business and take over their job. But we have an aging population. We have more and more retirees. So I keep telling companies that I work with, it's not really about replacing those humans and we're doing things cheaper or better. It's about actually that you're still able to do these things in 10 to 20 years, because all your engineers will be retired by then. So better automate this and use an AI. And I think that's the kind of understanding the EU or the European Commission should have, and educate our population to a very large extent about what AI is. So they actually see the benefits and they are also able to identify more use cases for AI.
Since we're talking about this issue on vision and mission, do you think that the AI world needs a forum to figure out legal, philosophical, ethical, and moral issues?
Yes, I think so, because it's not just tech. There are so many other things we need to bring in: law, ethics, philosophy, innovation management. Because otherwise, if you isolate these topics, like you isolate tech, then you're just building prototypes. If you isolate law, you're just coming up with regulation that doesn't work. So you need to build a bridge between these topics, and that's why we definitely need such a forum.
Well, besides the has any platform achieved that? What it does now, in your opinion?
I see that the yuan is definitely the most comprehensive and the most successful one. I think it's a great idea. And so far, there are so many new articles every month. I like to see the newsletter, and there are so many different perspectives and so many discussions now around it. And a lot of people keep talking about it on LinkedIn and in other social media. So I think it's certainly the leading one, and it's a very great initiative.
Okay, and I wanted to ask, could you describe what open medical data and AI's futures look like in the EU? I know that there is no clear strategy right now or an AI strategy, and even the vision and mission are not clearly there yet. But how would you describe the future to look like?
Well, it would be great if obviously we can further skyrocket healthcare by automating a lot of tasks that so far are manually done, like data entry, data curation, whatever. And there's so much data spread, but we're unable to combine this and take advantage of it. And I think using AI and open medical data will be able to provide cheaper and better healthcare given an aging population, and potentially we will have less doctors in the future because they also keep aging and retiring. And so we need to be more effective and more efficient. And I think AI and open medical data would be great to do this. Would also allow us possibly to tackle rare diseases, because if you have a rare disease, you're sort of doomed right now, because maybe five other people have that disease in your city or your country, whatever. But if you pool the data from all those people in Europe, you may be able to find a pattern and then a cure.
Well, this is maybe a tricky one, Patrick. You've been making the case that the EU's systems aren't particularly doing a good job. Who is the best advocate that things in the EU are going quite well and we just need to make a few tweaks and we're going to get to this vision which you highlighted, which I think is a fantastic vision, which is skyrocketing healthcare in Europe, uh, automating it, more innovation, more competition. So, who is the best defender of what we might call the status quo? Because Emir and myself might want to invite him or her onto a future show.
Well, maybe invite the president of the commission, Miss von der Leyen, and maybe talk to her. Because so far, what I see is not very convincing, but maybe there is a bigger strategy that she wants to follow that so far we have not seen. Maybe very difficult to invite her, obviously. But I guess starting early next year, most of the EU will be, or of the European Commission and Parliament will be focusing on the coming election, and maybe there'll be a change then in 2024 with a new vision, and that's something I would be very happy about.
Because there must be smart, intelligent, thoughtful, well informed people throughout the EU. When I had many business dealings with people in Finland, I was always impressed. This is from my days working with Nokia. They were pragmatic, sensible, visionary as well. There must be people who are in the circle of the EU Commission, and we just need to track them down and have an honest discussion with them, I think.
Yeah, one more recommendation would be Mr. Voss. He's a member of the European Parliament for the EPP group. So far, he's very supportive with, simplifying the AI Act. I've dealt with him numerous times, and he's certainly, and the EPP is the largest group in the European Parliament, and he's sort of the main advocate there for simplifying the AI Act and making it more realistic. Maybe he could be a good guest as well.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, what are you focusing on this year? Are you working on anything exciting? And well, I mean, if there are, do you have any final remarks you want to point out?
Well, I've just published a new book with Springer, and I'm starting to get more and more feedback on that. It's called The Future Circle of Healthcare. It just appeared about a month ago. I published it together with three fellow editors. Possibly next year, I want to work on another book, and possibly also addressing AI and healthcare. So I'm looking forward to this. Plenty of new projects, and hopefully I'll also be able to write more articles for the yuan in the coming year.
Well, thanks. This is all in the spirit of continuing an open discussion and not just locking ourselves into our own echo chambers.
Thank you for listening to the Delta Dialogue. This episode is brought to you by Duyuan, a tech community focused on artificial intelligence in healthcare, machine learning, and related disciplines. I am Amir Mustafa, and see you next time.